Born in 1920, James L. Farmer grew up in Texas in the era of militant racial segregation in the American South. On a hot summer day, when James Farmer was just about 3.5 years old, he went to a whites-only store to purchase a Coke and was denied. Although James Farmer has had many encounters with the pain of segregation, that early encounter really planted the seeds of discontent for him. And so he was motivated from that incident on to end racial segregation and racial inequality. James Farmer embraced Mahatma Gandhi's ideals of activism through nonviolent protest. His most notable work was co-founder and leader of CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality. Through this organization, Farmer used nonviolent protests to systematically perforate the lines between black and white spaces. Blacks who advocated more aggressive avenues for change often viewed Farmer's pacifist ideals as a weakness rather than a strength. They were known to ask him, "When are you going to fight back?" Farmer would reply, "We are fighting back. We're only using different weapons." Perhaps Farmer's most well-known protest was the Freedom Ride of 1961. Although the Supreme Court ruled in 1960 that segregated public buses were unconstitutional, the southern states ignored the ruling, and the federal government did nothing to enforce the new rule. On May 4, 1961, 13 riders, black and white, boarded a bus in Washington, D.C., and were scheduled to arrive in New Orleans on May 17. Throughout the trip, all riders, both black and white, used the whites-only sections of the bus terminals, including the restrooms, waiting rooms, and restaurants. They were greeted with hatred and bloody violence at virtually every stop. But when the riders were injured or arrested, new riders came to fill the spaces, and the journey continued. The Freedom Ride placed a public spotlight on the newly passed desegregation laws and put pressure on the federal government to enforce them. The protests served as one of the first cracks in the dam and opened the floodgates for desegregation throughout the United States. During Black History Month, we have chosen to honor James Farmer and his memory and contributions to freedom and equality. Farmer published his biography, Lay Bare the Heart, in 1985. The work recounts his life story, sometimes with poignant tenderness, often with a fire of injustice, but always with unvarnished honesty. The following excerpts detail a few of Farmer's experiences in the Freedom Rides.
The eclipse was only partial, though. Fear shone through. If any man says that he had no fear in the actions of the 60s, he is a liar, or without imagination. If there were those who think that the leaders were exceptions to that and were strangers to fear, let me quickly disabuse them of such a notion. Frankly, I was scared spitless and desperately wanted to avoid taking that ride to Jackson. Alabama had chewed up the original 13 interracial core freedom riders. They had been brutalized, hospitalized, and in one case disabled by flame, club, and pummeling fists. Across the Alabama line from Georgia, blacks had been brutally pistol-whipped and clubbed with blackjacks and fists and then thrown, bloodied, into the back of the bus. Whites had been clobbered even worse for trying to intervene. One suffered a stroke as a result and was paralyzed forever. A bus had been burned to the ground in Anniston, Alabama, and the Freedom Riders, escaping with their lives, were hospitalized for smoke inhalation. In the Birmingham bus depot, Jim Peck, a white man, had been left for dead in a pool of his own blood. His head required 53 stitches. How many stitches could repair the heart that bled for the nation? And fortuitously, I had missed that carnage on the ride from Atlanta to Montgomery due to the death of my father. But how would I escape Mississippi? If Alabama had been purgatory, Mississippi would be hell. Black students from Nashville, members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, their numbers augmented by youthful Black Corps members from New Orleans, had dashed in to catch in midair the baton dropped by the initial 13. They had not asked if I would ride with them. They assumed that I would.
But the decision had not come without inner pain. After all, when I took over the helm of Corps 4 months earlier, I had said that I would be no armchair general, tied to the tent. I would not send troops, but would go with them. But that was bravado, born of remoteness from reality. Who would expect me to risk being cut down so early in the promise of a leadership career? There would be many other battles, much time to show courage. And how could I let myself be wiped out now, before anyone outside the inner circle of the movement even knew I was there? Not now, maybe later. Yet a grain of ambivalence struck in my craw. Maybe a still small voice would speak. A part of me hoped so, but if it spoke, I was certain that I would close my ears, though just in case I had packed my suitcase and tossed it into the trunk of a staff car, and along with it my inner turmoil. When the kids boarded the buses, I watched as a father seeing his children leave the home, as they must, and race into an uncertain future. Typically, the father was sad because he could not go with them. They had to go alone. The Greyhound was boarded by some SNVCC people, but mostly by Corps people. The Corps contingent had come at my urging, transmitted by my staff in New York to keep the revolution going. They fully expected the protection my presence would provide. They filed in and took seats. I stood outside and waved farewell. The windows were open and I extended my hand through to shake hands with a pretty 17-year-old Corps girl from New Orleans. She took the hand with puzzlement. "My prayers are with you, Doris," I said. "Have a safe trip, and when it's over, we'll get together and decide what we have to do next to finish the job." Doris Castle's eyes, straight with fear, became huge balls of terror. "You're coming with us, aren't you, Jim?" she whispered. I went through my prearranged litany of excuses. I'd been away from the office for 4 weeks. My desk was piled high with papers. People would be angry with Corps if they got no timely response to their letters, would not contribute money. Someone had to raise money to fuel these buses to keep the revolution going. As national director, I had a solemn responsibility to mind the store. All of us want to be where the action is, but no such luck. Some of us are stuck with the dull jobs, the supportive ones. I could not be there in person, but she knew I'd be there in spirit. Eyes wide, shook her head slowly, brushing away all my words. Brain did not believe what ears were hearing. She spoke softly in a stage whisper, but the words hit like a trip hammer, driving me, it seemed, partway into the pavement. "Jim, please." "Get my luggage," I shouted to a Corps staffer standing nearby. "Put it on the damn bus. I'm going." Doris didn't smile, she just looked, and she suddenly looked tired. Kids growing up fast under fire, and sometimes grow old, like in the war.
In addition to the kids, 6 reporters were aboard. This was the story of the day. The headlines, TV. No reporter worth his salt would miss it, whatever the risk. On their faces was the expectancy of great bylines, immortal photos. 6 Alabama National Guardsmen were also on the bus, with rifles and fixed bayonets. Their hearts, no doubt, were on the other side. Which way would they point their guns, I wondered. Helicopters chopped overhead, scanning the woods and roads. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy had moved at last. He had ignored the Freedom Ride until the bus was burned at Anniston and blood was spattered all over Alabama, and headlines screamed a tale all over the world. I had rejected his call for a halt and a cooling off period. but he had moved. State police sirens howled up and down the highway, warning Klansmen that they were outgunned. The feds were watching. As wheels pounded concrete, a lavender haze fogged my brain. I longed for rest. Some of the kids were writing something. Diaries? No, we don't write. We talk. I looked, and it was names and addresses of next of kin. The young men stuffed those grim messages in their pockets, the women in their bras. I dozed. When the senses can endure no more, mercifully they cut off. Later, I was told that we had not stopped at Selma as planned, for there had been a mob waiting, with chains, clubs, and guns. We would have to stop at Jackson, for that was our destination. What would be waiting there?
Mississippi's Governor, Ross Barnett, had been on the airwaves and television for several days, urging the rural folk and the rednecks to stay home and let the law take its course. Whoever violated their sacred segregation laws would be duly punished. But by the law, I felt, of course, that Governor Barnett was not concerned for our lives, but for his state's image, while he romanced northern industry. If we got ourselves killed, let it be not on his turf, but across the state line. When the bus pulled into Jackson, there was an eerie stillness. The streets were nearly deserted. Maybe Ross Barnett had succeeded, or maybe everyone was at the bus terminal waiting for us. We pulled into the terminal, and there it was, the huge crowd of white men standing there, solemn, unexpressive faces, just standing. This is it, I thought, but it's what we came for. We can't sit here and hide. I made my way down the steps of the bus. A Nashville student, Lucretia Collins, followed me out the door and linked arms. Her soft nearness was reassuring, and her faint fragrance comforted me. The crowd curiously did not attack, but divided, forming a passageway to the white waiting room. They knew where we were going. Head high, I looked to neither side, trying to conceal my apprehension. That crowd, I later learned, was made up of federal agents, plainclothes policemen, and media people. Ross Barnett's appeal had worked. Lucretia and I, arm in arm, crossed the white waiting room, sipped from the white water fountain, and walked to the white restaurant entrance. And there was Captain Ray, blocking the doorway. He asked my name and nodded slightly when I told him. 3 times he ordered us to move on, and 3 times I refused, on the grounds of the Supreme Court decision in the Boynton case. He asked me if we understood his order, and I replied, perfectly. It was all very civilized. The nation was watching through newsreel cameras. Bigotry had many faces, And unlike Alabama, where Klan hooliganism had been allowed to run amok, Mississippi was putting its best face forward.
When the captain ordered the arrest and commanded us to the patrol wagon, a grimace swept Lucretia's features and quickly vanished. "What are the charges?" I asked. He looked at the ceiling momentarily, then replied, "Disturbing the peace, disobeying an officer, and inciting a riot." My companion and I turned, followed the waiting policeman, and climbed into the patrol wagon. The wagon filled quickly with youthful freedom riders, directed there by Captain Ray's thrusting finger. The doors were slammed shut and latched, and the wagon leaped forward toward the jail. The quiet city was violated by the siren of the squad car escorting us. Somehow, the sirens of Jackson seemed fiercer and angrier than any I'd ever heard. The wagon drew to a halt. Its doors were unlatched, and we filed out. Camera eyes blinked. 24 policemen with rifles stood at alert. We were silently motioned through the Jackson City Jail. In single file, we entered through the cordon of protectors. As the doors closed behind us, it shut out the smell of magnolia blossoms. It also shut out civility. The police processing us made no attempt to hide their hatred and frustration at being forced to exercise even a modicum of restraint. Their habit, beyond doubt, was to beat and even kill blacks with impunity. And they baited us, digging for an excuse to indulge the habit. No real provocation was needed. Our presence, challenging what was beyond challenge, was provocation enough. But Washington was watching now, and they had their orders. They had better not take liberties with the hated Kennedys. They need no excuse, though, to hurl epithets. We were called niggers and black bastards and threatened with billy clubs. I cautioned our group to patience and forbearance, for we had a long ordeal ahead of us. 2 of the white freedom riders paused at the open door where we were, started to walk in, and were jerked back. They grinned and gave us the V for victory sign before being roughly shoved on. Our group broke into loud applause and shouts of, "All right!" Then the irrepressible and thunderous singing. It was the second stanza of We Shall Overcome. Like an echo, the same words blasted back at us from down the corridor. Then there was scuffling down there and some pounding of fists against flesh, and the singing stopped. In our room, our tormentors began rushing around in panic, waving billy clubs over their heads, shouting, "Cut out that noise! Cut it out now!" We sang it over and over. Women's voices wafted through the doors and crevices of another wing with the same song. From another floor, the white freedom riders answered. The jailhouse rocked with songs of the freedom riders. Pre-dawn Jackson had never heard the likes of it before. We were all hyper from adrenaline pumping madly through our bodies. We had raced into the bowels of the Never Never Land, and we were still alive. If we could only keep the momentum of this drive going, Southern segregation was doomed.
Our trial was perfunctory, the verdict instantaneous. 1 year in jail for everyone. I urged all who could to remain in jail for 40 days, the maximum one could serve and still file an appeal in Mississippi. We wanted to fill up the jails and place a greater burden on the state as possible for as long as we could. Perhaps segregation would be seen as too heavy an albatross for the ship of the state to bear. One day's mail brought a letter from my wife. It was a joyous letter. Lula had known my fears and understood them, and was filled with pride when informed by my staff that I had taken the ride to Jackson. And when she had learned from the news that her husband was safely behind bars, that pride was mixed with overwhelming relief. Friends had come over to our Greenwich Village apartment and had celebrated. Lula related that one had said, "Jim really did it. I know he was scared, but he did it anyway." Another had raised his glass for a toast to Thoreau, and recounted the familiar Emerson Thoreau anecdote. Emerson, seeing Thoreau in jail, cried, "Thoreau, my dear friend, what in the world are you doing in there?" Thoreau replied, "Emerson, my dear friend, what in the world are you doing out there?" This is a place for honest men in times like these. My 40th day of imprisonment was just beyond the coming night. I lay down early to contemplate. Outside, as the night began to fall, lightning knifed through heavy clouds and skies opened up and dumped oceans on parchment. While the summer storm raged outside, my heart was at peace. Not one of the men and women who shared the freedom ride could ever be the same. Nothing would ever again be routine. No more humdrum. A Promethean spark had somehow been infused into the soul of each of us. The younger ones had left little of their youth in the prison cells. They had aged, matured. The older were surely younger now, more enthralled with freedom, imbued with its quest.
Although James Farmer's name is synonymous with the Freedom Rides, that certainly wasn't his first nor his last role in the activist movement. In 1942, he co-founded CORE, Congress for Racial Equality. It was in no small part due to Farmer's leadership that many people, both black and white, came together and became a force that could not be denied. For the next 20 years, he masterminded and led nonviolent protests such as sit-ins, marches, and rallies, all focused to challenge the whites-only rule that segregated America. Just a few years after the famed Freedom Rides, President Lyndon B. Johnson eliminated Jim Crow laws when he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Although it was a victory, Farmer knew the work was not done. He continued his life in public service. Over the years, he founded and served in the Center for Community Action, the Council on Minority Planning and Strategy, and the Public Policy Training Institute. He also served as the Assistant Director of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. James Farmer spent the last years of his career as a history professor at the University of Mary Washington College in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he continued his work by educating and leading a new generation. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded James Farmer the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition of his lifelong work in civil rights. It is the highest honor a civilian can earn. James Farmer died in 1999, but his legacy is evident in every classroom, every restaurant, and every public arena where the population is not segregated into groups according to like skin color. His book, Lay Bare the Heart, records the trials, the joys, the fears and frustrations, and the triumphs in this man's extraordinary life. It is his final and lasting gift to everyone who embraces freedom and equality. We encourage you to read his book and walk with him as he retraces his extraordinary life.